Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Tarek Masoud. I'm a professor at the Kennedy School of Government and the faculty director of our Middle East Initiative, and it gives me an enormous amount of pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Christiana Parreira, who is a pre-doctoral research fellow with us this year at the Middle East Initiative and is currently wrapping up her dissertation in political science at Stanford. Christiana is one of the most gifted scholars of the Middle East that I have had the pleasure of encountering, and she works specifically on Lebanon, a country whose importance, I think, both to theory building in political science and to just the Middle East and its political development cannot be underestimated. In Lebanon, she focuses on political parties, how they develop, how they compete with each other, how they provide or don't provide social welfare. And she's specifically focusing in her dissertation on elite and family networks and their role in providing public goods at the municipal level in Lebanon, and why in some places they provide public goods and other places they just buy votes. She got her BA from Princeton, a fact that we will not hold against her, and we will also not hold against her the fact that she's going back to Princeton next year, but that's actually a source of joy. This is obviously an uncertain time, and when any of our fellows is able to achieve the recognition that they richly deserve in the world, and then we're all thrilled. So Christiana will talk about some of her research on Lebanon's current revolutionary moment. I should also note a couple of things. This is the last event of the Middle East Initiative for the academic year, and so we're going out on the highest of high notes. Christiana will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. The other thing I will note is that this meeting is being recorded and will likely live online. So if you do ask a question, just know that your whatever screen name you've chosen for yourself will be mentioned aloud. With that, let me turn it over to the great and powerful Dr. Christiana Parreira. Go ahead.
Thanks, Tarek, for that introduction. And let me just start sharing my screen. Okay, so thanks everybody for coming, and again to Tarek for that introduction. So my talk today is going to focus on some of the structural factors that have enabled the governance crisis we're seeing unfolding across Lebanon today. And just as a backdrop, across a variety of development indicators, including infrastructure quality, electricity, healthcare, Lebanon sees among some of the worst quality governance among countries in its income bracket. And since October, at the same time, Lebanon has seen some of the most unprecedented anti-government mobilization in the country's history. And so what I'm hoping is that this talk, based on some of my dissertation research, provides a little bit of a different perspective on two things. So on the one hand, why people have turned specifically to non-electoral modes of mobilization against the state, rather than electoral opposition in an electoral democracy. And second, why these protests have occurred simultaneously and in tandem across the country and have been sustained over time, specifically in the urban periphery outside of Beirut. So as I said, the talk will be based on dissertation research that I conducted in Lebanon from 2016 until earlier this year in 2020, off and on. And I'll be discussing contemporary patterns of governance in the country through a specifically local lens. So by that I mean looking specifically at local institutions, at their constituent elites, and the relationship that's formed over time in Lebanon between the local governments on the one hand and the central government on the other. So this image, for those who followed the protests from Lebanon or who perhaps streamed Lebanese TV from the outside, the screenshot was a kind of ubiquitous aspect of the protests. So from the first night on October 17th of last year, major TV outlets would use this kind of split screen to highlight simultaneously protests going on in 4, 5, sometimes even 8 cities at once. This is from an LBC broadcast shortly after the protests began. And what I want to suggest today is perhaps a little bit of a contradiction, but one that I hope to make sense of, which is that these protests were motivated in part by specifically local issues and grievances, but at the same time that there's a common thread running through these local issues by virtue of the relationship that's developed over the last few decades between local governments and the national regime. So just to overview what I'm going to be talking about today, central-local relations have played a really key role in Lebanon's governance crisis and the widespread nature of recent protests. And what I'm going to specifically argue is that ties between Lebanon's post-war multi-party regime and peripheral institutions have gradually evolved to produce an increasingly predatory mode of local rule. And specifically, I'll show and provide empirical evidence for the fact that co-optation of local governments by national parties is increasingly pervasive, and it's extinguished the viability of electoral opposition. Then I'll talk a little bit about the protests themselves, and I'll highlight how protest dynamics across different cities, looking specifically outside of Beirut, have reflected a diverse range of local grievances against this multi-party regime that's developed in Lebanon. And specifically, within different areas, this movement has produced different fissures within different religious and sectarian communities between the regime and its supporters on the one hand, and a newly empowered anti-regime opposition on the other. So this is sort of the order in which I'll go through things. I'll talk a little bit about the history of this, what I call center-periphery compact that's formed in Lebanon. Then I'll talk about what local governance looks like in the contemporary era. I'll talk a little bit about local trends in the October Revolution, and I'll present some original survey evidence on protest participation and polarization in one urban peripheral city, drawing from survey data that I quite unexpectedly collected during the protests in October and November. So just to give a historical overview of local governance in Lebanon, local governments were created beginning in the 19th century during this sort of reform era by the Ottoman state, but also specifically to contain a particularly violent episode of local disorder. So a civil war unfolding in Mount Lebanon that later spread into Greater Syria prompted the founding of the first municipal government in the town of Deir el-Amar in 1864. And over time, during successive French mandate, then early independence eras, municipal governments in Lebanon evolved into a key mechanism that the central state used to extend its authority. And this pact developed between peripheral institutions and the central state. National elites would deliver material resources to these local governments as needed, and local elites in turn would deliver loyalty from their constituents. Sorry, let me go back. But that being said, the formal duties allocated by law to local governments during this time, so moving from the early independence era in the 1940s up until the beginning of the Civil War, were actually quite limited compared to what they are today. So with that said, ties between the central government and local governments were basically severed as municipal elections came to an end. They weren't held from 1963 to 1998. And financial transfers ceased as the Civil War began in 1975. So during this time period, municipal councilors were appointed on a largely ad hoc basis by either the Qaim Maqam or the Muhafiz, the district or governorate heads. And a lot of local governments quickly ceased functioning by virtue of simply not having the resources that they used to derive from the central state to govern. At the same time, this pre-war elite class that had ruled the country from the 1940s through the 1970s began to cede power to new political forces, the forces that now occupy power in Lebanon. And this was predominantly sectarian militias, along with other political entrepreneurs. And what tied these militias and other forms of political entrepreneurship together was that they had independent, either self-generated or in many cases foreign sources of funding. So here I'm going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into an example of what local governance looked like and how it developed in one peripheral city in Saida, referred to interchangeably as Sidon. So Saida was a sort of prototypical peripheral urban space in pre-war Lebanon. Parochial elites like the Bizri family and later Ma'ruf Assad and his popular Nasserite organization dominated local politics. And the municipality was an important feature of local life, and it remained active during the Civil War, again, with councilors being appointed on an ad hoc basis. But it lacked the funding and resources necessary to really do anything of substantive import when it came to infrastructural development and that sort of thing. And this financial need was really escalated during the 1982 Israeli invasion, which completely devastated local infrastructure in the city. So things like road work, city street lighting, sanitation networks were basically destroyed during the invasion. And the municipal council offices themselves were basically razed to the ground. So shortly thereafter, a sort of newcomer to the political scene, an independently wealthy political entrepreneur, began bankrolling local governance, specifically by funding the city's reconstruction through donations via a personal foundation he founded to the municipality. And this nascent political entrepreneur was future Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, and soon even things like zoning initiatives and the maintenance and development of public spaces. So not the types of one-to-one clientelist goods we talk a lot about in political science, but actually public goods were developed and bankrolled by Rafiq Hariri through his foundation, which was first called the Higher Council for Municipal Projects and later became the Hariri Foundation, which still exists today. And meanwhile, understandably, the political influence and popularity of this pre-war political elite that preceded Hariri basically faded away. They simply didn't have the resources to compete with him. And this didn't just happen in Saida. There was an analogous trend in many peripheral areas, including Sur, Baalbek, and Tripoli, but to varying degrees. In some cases, like Tripoli, for example, a pre-war political class maintained far greater power into the post-war era. So now I'll talk a little bit about the structure of contemporary local governance and how it's developed under a multi-party regime that governs Lebanon today. So interestingly, a lot of critical legislation pertaining to contemporary local governance was passed during a lull in fighting during the Lebanese Civil War. So the Lebanese Civil War is often referred to as having taken place between 1975 and 1990, but really there were starts and stops. And there was one period of relative peace beginning in 1977, lasting, depending on when you frame it, to early 1979, late 1978. And during this period, a lot of legislation pertaining to the scope of local governance, in addition to the founding of certain institutions like the Council for Development and Reconstruction, was passed. But that being said, this legislation was obviously not implemented because the Civil War reemerged and continued. And it was only implemented after the Taif Agreement, after the end of the Civil War in 1990. So a really important 1977 decree vastly widens the scope of local governance responsibilities to many basic welfare services. This exempts things like electricity and water, but even those services, and I can talk more in the Q&A if people are interested, are informally handled in some cases by local governments. So that being said, most other basic welfare services are handled at least in part by local governments. And this is new. And in return, the central state is formally, as per a 1979 decree, supposed to give annual transfers to help local governments through the independent or autonomous municipal fund. So I'll refer to it as the IMF, not to confuse people with the other IMF. And the result of these legislative innovations was what some scholars in Lebanon have termed deconcentration, rather as opposed to either a fully decentralized or centralized governance system. And more specifically, the result is local governments in Lebanon have an incredibly heavy governance burden, akin to very decentralized states, but incredibly low capacity to actually provide those services without help from the central government. And it's worth noting here that in most municipalities, strategies of internal revenue generation like taxation are virtually non-existent. At the same time, these nascent political parties and factions that became popular during the Civil War are still consolidating power by the mid to late 1990s as this local governance system is developing. And they know, based on Lebanese history, that local elites constitute a really, really valuable resource. They can bolster parties' popularity and electoral support. Many of these municipal elites are already co-opted into party networks during the Civil War. And so for this reason, party sponsorship of municipal council lists quickly spreads across most urban and peri-urban areas, places where people live, places that parties actually care about as resources for electoral power. And we don't necessarily have reasons to expect that this should be a bad thing, right? There's a large literature in political science that expects, again, generalizing across a lot of different types of parties, and we can argue about what types of political parties these parties in Lebanon are, but generally speaking, more party competition should actually provide incentives for better governance, right? More competition fields better candidates, it potentially enhances elite accountability. But I'm going to argue that that's not really the case for a pretty clear reason. Which is that at all levels of government, Lebanese parties have engaged in what I refer to in my dissertation as sort of cartel-like behavior to preclude inter-party competition in ways that really, really shape the nature of governance and the nature of local governance. So at the national level, basically all post-2005, post-Syrian occupation Lebanese governments have been those of national unity. So even if parties compete during elections, afterwards they come together to form usually basically all party governments with a few minor exceptions. And at the local level, these collusive strategies are even more obvious. So you see active alliances formed between even very ideologically opposed political parties, both during and after local elections. So in 2004, Hezbollah and Amal formed a pact that allied them in municipal electoral competition, whereas in 1998 they had competed. And this pact, I would say, based on my fieldwork in Shia majority municipalities, includes specifications as to how many seats each party will get on a list, and also the sectarian composition of each party's distribution. So even though that's not allocated in law, these pacts, these parties have basically allocated it through these informal pacts. A similar agreement happened between the two major Christian political parties in Lebanon, the Lebanese Forces and the Free Patriotic Movement, which are explicitly ideologically opposed, but formed an alliance in municipal electoral competition as part of a larger agreement, the Ma'arab Agreement, that also brought General Michel Aoun to the presidency. And similar arrangements have occurred within other sectarian groups. The Future Movement, for example, usually puts aside its ideological differences to ally with different locally specific Sunni elites and factions in municipal elections. Within the Druze community, Wali Jumblat and the Arslanis formed an agreement similarly, even though they're, again, ideologically opposed in a lot of ways. And these alliances also occur between religious sects. So in most municipal races, you see parties across sects also allying. So who are they allying against? As a result of this type of cartel behavior, municipal electoral competition usually occurs between a national party alliance on the one hand and an independent opposition on the other hand. And I use independent loosely just to refer to people who are running explicitly against the parties. And this normally includes one of the following, or these independent oppositions normally fall into one of the following categories. The first are clan and family networks that maintained influence prior to the civil war, and regional leaders who are often referred to as Zuama in Lebanon. So people like Michel Moore in Metin, or the Scaf family in Zahle. You also see the rise in some cases of party defectors, people who have risen to power within one of the major parties and then defected. A prominent example of this is former Justice Minister Ashraf Rifi, who fielded a list in the second largest city in the country, Tripoli, and won in 2016 in a surprise victory. You also see, particularly as of the latest municipal elections in 2016, the rise of reformist lists like Beirut Medinati and modeled off of Beirut Medinati, Baalbek Medinati. And so these descriptives are gathered using data that was collected in collaboration with the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. And this is based on a survey and other key municipal contacts in all of Lebanon's roughly 1,000 municipalities right after the 2016 municipal elections. And what we see here is that in terms of percent of seats, percent of municipalities, and percent of co-sectarian municipalities, these parties control significant swaths of the country through this endorsement or sponsorship of municipal council lists. So in particular, you see that Hezbollah, for example, controls about 73% of Shia majority municipalities in terms of its fielding of municipal lists. Now, this isn't true for every political party. Hezbollah is by far the most effective in this realm. But you see for all of the major parties, they're controlling upwards of 15% or more of these municipalities. And the municipalities that they are controlling are by and large the ones with the most people in them. And here you can see that as seat size, which is approximately sort of approximate for population size, as municipalities grow larger, parties are more inclined to run municipal lists in them. And across municipalities of all size, you can see that parties are by and large achieving overwhelming rates of victory. So when they run against these regional networks, these family-based groups, and these reformist lists, by and large, they are winning. And as you can see on the bottom row, municipal council lists run by parties are very rarely competing against other party-based factions. So these parties, while their sort of collusive tendencies do sometimes fall apart, you see in 10% of the largest municipalities, they are running against each other. This is by and large very rare behavior. So overwhelmingly, they're colluding with one another and competing against other factions. And so one of the key arguments that I make in my dissertation project is that parties form a center-local compact with municipalities, leveraging this post-war system of municipal governance. So parties co-opt local elites who can enhance their local credibility and their ability to mobilize support in future electoral cycles. And local elites in return for this gain access to the central state resources that they need in order to govern, which are controlled by this multi-party regime. So parties are essentially leveraging their outsized resource control at the national level, and they use this to reward loyal local governments and to punish others. And they can do this because the funding and bureaucratic approval necessary to govern on an everyday basis at the local level is monopolized by these parties, specifically via their ministerial control through these governments of unity, national unity. So in this way, even welfare goods that are public or programmatic, that is, they're non-excludable at a communal level, become clientelized at that level by these parties. And I'll say, as a side note, but which is actually kind of important to this line of argumentation, is that the services that these parties do provide in their electorally loyal local governments have a notoriously high burn rate, due largely to corruption associated with improper contracting procedures. So even when governance is provided, it's provided on the party's terms. So this analysis is using data I collected with LCPS in addition to the original survey that I fielded in 2019, and it's demonstrating an association between party control and governance quality. And here I can talk more about the empirical strategy if people are interested, but I'm using a basic multi-level modeling strategy that accounts for both individual and contextual level variables to assess this relationship. And so using multiple measures, including road quality on the right, frequency of municipal town halls on the left, and overall respondent rated governance quality, I'm finding that party controlled local governments are performing better, albeit in an overall poor governance environment. So I'll add a few qualifiers. This isn't panel data, that doesn't exist, frankly. And party control is not randomly assigned. But this empirical strategy is accounting for some potential confounders at the individual and municipal level. So some key takeaways from what I've just discussed. First, what I've showed is that Lebanon's party alliance uses an overwhelming resource advantage to gradually eradicate sources of electoral opposition, specifically in local elections. And local governments, which are supposed to be and are legally specified as front lines of welfare provision on an everyday basis, must choose within this institutional context between becoming effective brokers of these political parties or just being neglected, and by extension, probably not being reelected. And so electoral opposition, even in local governments, becomes an increasingly unviable political strategy. So why does this matter? I want to highlight some systemic features of the protests that have happened in Lebanon since October, and sort of how I think they fit in with some of the claims that I've made earlier. So criticism within this protest movement, I would say, has commonly been targeted at what people are explicitly framing as a collusive multi-party regime. So on the left, you see a photo of two women. they're holding up pictures depicting some of the three main party leaders, Saad Hariri, Nabi Berri, and Michel Aoun, and the caption basically just says, leave. And there's been an overwhelming focus, additionally, within these protests on the state, on this multi-party regime's track record of incredibly poor service provision, and at the same time, the degree to which it uses service provision as a way of predating state resources. And another interesting sort of systemic feature of these protests is how a lot of calls for institutional reform have said that this type of reform needs to precede early elections. So people understand electoral mechanisms of opposition as having been fundamentally foreclosed by the way in which elites use elections. So that being said, because this talk is kind of about local issues in Lebanon, I want to highlight some of the divergences in these protests across different parts of the country, both within and across different areas of partisan control. And I think that there have been key differences in how in both patterns of mobilization and repression. In terms of mobilization, the number of participants in different peripheral areas has been really dramatically different. And this is true even within areas controlled by the same political party or party alliances. So for example, in Sur, Tyre in the south, you've seen much greater mobilization in a city controlled by the Hezbollah Amal alliance, as opposed to Baalbek, another city controlled by that same alliance. And in Baalbek, for example, the protests, while they have been significant, only kicked up about, according to people I spoke with, a week after they began elsewhere on October 17th. There have also been significant differences in the tactics used by protesters. The protests have been universally nonviolent, but that being said, the degree to which protesters have leveraged strategies like destruction of property has been far greater in Tripoli and Saida, particularly recently, than elsewhere. There are also really dramatic differences in the use of party-backed violence, with a pretty dramatic uptick in this type of use of party-sponsored security in areas controlled by Hezbollah and Amal movement. And finally, conversely, in some areas, you do see variation in the degree to which parties have supported, or probably more accurately, co-opted these protests. So the Lebanese forces and the Kateb, two Christian parties, have kind of adopted a reformist strategy as in response to the protests. And you've seen voicing of support for them by various members of the party, and even kind of active participation in some cases. We've also seen alleged roadblock coordination in certain parts of the country, not only by the Aleph and the Kateb, but also by the Future Movement and other political parties. I also want to highlight key differences in the organizing actors behind these protests. There's been a comparatively greater role in the capital of reformist and civil society groups, particularly those that trace their origins back to the U-Stink protests, the last sort of large-scale anti-government mobilization in 2015. These are groups like Liha'i, Beirut Medinati, Benin Hasib. There are many. But outside the capital, at least from people that I spoke with, the influence of these types of groups is far more limited. Not to say that it's non-existent, but it's far more limited compared to other groups like professional syndicates, leftist groups, including but not limited to the Communist Party, and religious associations. And I want to talk a little bit about Tripoli as a sort of epicenter at the regional level of urban peripheral protest outside of Beirut. And this has been well covered in the media, but I want to kind of shed a local perspective on what people are protesting about, and the shape of different sorts of mobilizing actors who have been important in those protests specifically. And in Tripoli, you see a really heavy emphasis, again, related to what you see in other parts of the country, on the collusive tendencies of the city's Sunni majority political elite. This is a Sunni majority city. And there's a heavy emphasis on the fact that these elites have colluded in local governance historically, despite being completely ideologically opposed. So critiques are targeted at a diversity of different actors within the Sunni political elite class in the city. So not only the Future Movement and Saad Hariri, but also the Azam movement, a local political party headed by former Prime Minister Najib Mikati, along with the pre-war ruling class, like current Member of Parliament Faisal Karame. You also see a lot of discussion, not just of underdevelopment in the periphery writ large, but of specifically local development issues. So in Tripoli, these include the perpetually abandoned plans to revitalize the local fairground, the Rashid Karame International Fair. Again, perpetually abandoned plans to build another airport. This is the second largest city in the country. If one were to build an airport, it would make sense to build it there. And a solid waste treatment facility that was opened, then closed unceremoniously soon after in late 2018. You also see a really important mobilizing influence that's slightly different from what you see in dynamics in the capital of Sunni hardliner elites, in particular people like former Justice Minister Ashraf Rifi. And Ashraf Rifi, who fielded a winning slate of municipal candidates in 2016, is an example of the sort of elite within Lebanese politics who's an outsider styled from the, sort of outsider taken from the inside. And he's really effectively over the last 4 or 5 years leveraged revanchist rhetoric and the sort of rhetoric of Sunnis having been dispossessed, having not been represented well enough by their elites. And he says that even as someone who has certainly been a part of the elite class historically. And so he sort of toes this fine line. And in doing so, it seems like after a period of decline in his popularity over the last 2 or 3 years, that he's seen a resurgence since the revolution. And he's formed this sort of loose coalition called Guardians of the City that's played an increasingly important role in these protests. And I'll also add that perhaps unsurprisingly, given the local governance context that I've described, the Tripoli municipality has publicly backed and aided the protesters with in-kind support. So just to conclude this portion of the talk, local crises of governance that have unfolded since the end of the Civil War across Lebanon, I want to argue have influenced the protest movement and the way it looks different in different cities in important ways. With that being said, the country's different municipalities are united by a local governance system that puts them in a common bind. So these grievances, though they're locally specific, also have a very similar flavor. And though with the current government under Hassan Diab, this party cartel that I've described remains partly intact and basically no institutional reforms have been enacted, the popularity of this diverse range of self-styled outsiders, even those from within the political elite class, has risen and doesn't appear to be fading. So now I'll talk a little bit about some of the data that I collected during the protests. And so some early descriptives on who was protesting on the one hand, and then also some changes in political expression and partisanship that may have occurred as a result of the protests. So for this, I'll be relying on a survey that I conducted in Lebanon between September and late November, late December of 2019. And this was a nationally representative survey at the district level, and it included a variety of questions on the quality of local governance, people's receipt of clientelism, people's partisanship, and their participation in local and national elections. And as part of this survey, it was not only nationally representative, but we also did an oversample of 2 major municipalities, Saida and Tripoli. And in Saida, the oversample included a total of about 430 respondents. So that was the plan. And what we didn't plan is that the survey responses in Saida were collected beginning on October 15th of last year. We collected 83 respondents with responses with a team of enumerators before the night of October 17th when the protest began. So to respect the safety of the enumerator team, we paused the survey for 26 days. And after a lot of back and forth and careful consideration, we resumed data collection a few weeks later and completed the remaining responses by the end of November. And so from here, we have responses from 300 some odd people after the protest began in Saida, and we can compare the responses from the majority of people who did not protest with the minority of respondents who we surveyed who did protest. And so we can see basically on demographic terms, the systematic differences, at least descriptively, between people who protested and people who didn't. And what we find is that protesters were significantly younger They were significantly more educated and, interestingly, twice as likely to have a university degree. They were far more male than the survey pool as a whole, and they were also far more likely to be unemployed. It's also interesting to note how protesters and non-protesters didn't differ. So, for example, they were not more likely to be economically insecure, according to this data. And there was also not a big difference in the sectarian composition, within SAIDA at least, of their protester versus non-protester respondent pool. And we also found, although this difference isn't statistically significant, it's still interesting that protesters were less likely to have voted in the last elections in 2018, suggesting some validity to this claim that people protested because they saw electoral opposition as having been delegitimized over time. So that's a sort of descriptive claim about protesters versus non-protesters. In terms of assessing whether protests changed political attitudes during this period in which the survey was taking place, this is a really hard question to answer, and it's one that political scientists have focused on a lot recently. This question of how to causally identify change as a result of and immediately following participation in protests. And this is for a few reasons. Protests are really hard to predict. So before versus after comparisons are really rare. Most people just simply aren't collecting the data in the pre-period. Additionally, standard annual panel data and every once in a couple years data, like the Arab Barometer, can't capture the sorts of rapid changes that occur during protest movements over weeks or months. And so panel data is likely to be confounded by a lot of other things that are taking place alongside these protests. And simply comparing protesters versus non-protesters by level of participation in the protests, essentially, that's not a causal comparison because people select into protests for a lot of reasons. And I've already showed you how the protester versus non-protester respondent pools in Lebanon really differ. So in recent years, political scientists have adopted some interesting experimental approaches to measuring the effect of protests on people's political attitude and behavior, but they're largely focusing on different outcomes. They're looking at whether or not it causes people to participate again. And usually these strategies are basically relying on the assumption that people were assigned into protest participation as if random. And there are a variety of different strategies that people use for that purpose. So the identification strategy that I'm using here is slightly different than those approaches. Causal identification of the effect of protest exposure, for me, looking at the pre and post respondent pools, relies on the assumption of functional equivalence between these two pools. So in other words, the only difference between people surveyed in SAIDA before the protest began as opposed to after should be the exposure to protests themselves. So if this were a normal, like a lab experiment or a field experiment that had been designed ex ante, I could evaluate that through true randomization and through looking at the treated and controlled respondent pools systematically before the study began. But I can't do that here. So instead, what I need to do is look at balance checks on major demographic variables and assess the spatial distribution of responses by neighborhood to make sure there wasn't significant clustering. So for example, if all of the pre-protest respondents had been sampled from one neighborhood in SAIDA and all of the post from another, that would be a problem. So even if these conditions are met, protest exposure, the sort of treatment that I'm looking at and is trying to assess the effect of, is a bundled treatment. It includes direct participation, and as I said, about 68% of the people sampled in the post-protest, or sorry, 68 people sampled in the post-protest wave did actively participate in these protests. It also includes in-person observation. So even if people didn't participate, SAIDA is a pretty small city. They might have walked by a protest or seen it. Media coverage, which was widespread throughout Lebanon, and conversations about the protests, sort of processing them through conversations with family, friends, colleagues. So here I'm looking to see whether or not there are any systematic differences between the pre-protest and post-protest respondent pools. And here what I find is that basically in terms of differences, there are no statistically significant differences between these two pools. So this is good. This allows us to sort of proceed with this assumption that the only difference between these two pools, the only significant difference, is exposure to these protests themselves. So because the responses in Saida were geolocated, we can also look to see whether there's significant clustering by neighborhood. And what we see is that while there is a little bit of clustering, you can kind of see that this was all surveyed before the protest, this was all surveyed after. In general, especially in the old city on the right, you can see that there's a fair amount of diversity or sort of even distribution of where the responses were drawn from, even within different neighborhoods, before versus after the protests. So in this sort of early analysis that I'm presenting, what I'm interested in terms of the outcome of interest and how it's changing as a result of the protests are these partisan displays that are really ubiquitous throughout Lebanon, and specifically the display of political iconography. And on the left here, this is a picture of Saida before the protests began. On the left of the left picture, you can see a poster of Osama Saad. He's the local politician and the head of the Popular Nasserite Organization. On the left, you can see a picture of former Prime Minister and current Future Movement head, Saad Hariri. And this is an interesting measure because it's not relying on respondents' own evaluation of their political beliefs or behavior. It's actually the enumerators of the survey reporting whether respondents to our survey had displayed posters depicting some political figure on the exterior of the respondents' residence. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm only going to be talking about those results, but the survey enumerators also reported displays of political iconography in the interior of people's homes, along with various forms of non-political religious iconography. And what we find is that there are significant upticks in the display of political iconography after the protests. So these are essentially the effects of the protests on displays of political iconography. Now, because we didn't record what the political iconography was, we can't be sure whether this is driven by protesters and supporters of the protest movement displaying pro-protest religious iconography, or non-protesters and people who don't support the protest movement displaying photos like this one or this one of Saad Hariri or Osama Saad, these sort of extant mainstream political elites. That being said, when we look, we see that these changes are driven specifically by people who didn't protest, and that people who were protesting were not displaying any more political iconography than they had in the pre-protest wave, than the pre-protest wave had. And what we see on the right is that these results appear to be driven by supporters of mainstream political parties in Saida, so specifically the Future Movement, Tayyar Mustaqbal, and the PNO, the Popular Nasserite Organization. So while these results are still pretty preliminary, what I'd like to tentatively suggest is that the protest movement, that as a result of the protests, we've seen an increase not just in anti-systemic sentiment, but also in polarization. Whether this is some form of counter-mobilization from the top down by the parties themselves, or a sort of affirmation from the bottom up of mainstream partisanship, even as protesters are chipping away at the legitimacy of these political parties. If it's some combination thereof, then this kind of polarization that's occurring is still quite interesting. So just to wrap up, because I'm interested in hearing people's questions and feedback, what I've argued today is that Lebanon's kind of peculiar system of local governance, by no means unique, is quite adept at giving incumbent parties and elites an overwhelming advantage in electoral competition, and it effectively extinguishes the viability of electoral opposition. The result of this system is that local governments and their constituent municipal councilors are held ultimately accountable not to ordinary voters, but rather to party elites. And I would argue that this is a key, certainly not the only, motivating factor behind these specifically extra electoral forms of political mobilization. And I would conclude by saying that it seems like the ultimate political benefactors of this protest movement are very much to be decided. These protests, as I've shown through some early data analysis, may have not only increased anti-systemic sentiments, but also increased polarization more broadly. And what I would like to, again, very tentatively suggest is that these sort of self-styled outsiders from within the political elite class, people like Osama Saad's local movement in Saida and Ashraf Rifi in Tripoli, that these types of people seem poised to resurge in popularity, potentially alongside a more reformist class. So with that, thank you. And yeah, thanks for staying through the finish.
Thanks very much, Christiana. That was really fascinating, gave a lot of food for thought. So I'm actually going to abuse my position and ask the first question. So Christiana, you described in the first part of your talk, which was about local governance in Lebanon and how the kind of local governance structure of Lebanon emerged. There's a lot of very interesting material there, and I would love to hear from you, not now, but maybe you should write this, the story of the 1977 passage of the municipal governance. That just strikes me as a very interesting policy episode, that policy/legislative episode that it would be useful to unpack. But the take-home point from that part of the talk was that these, political parties that have this kind of national, kind of what Dan Slater called promiscuous power sharing, that we see operating also at the local level. And so if you are a local notable or a local elite who wants to have some role in municipal governance, the only way to do that is through this structure of these existing political parties. And you then show that, in fact, it's mainly in the places where the existing political parties win the elections and they actually have the control the municipal government, that we'll find in those places better outcomes than in the places where presumably non-party people are winning. So I want to, that was an interesting finding, and I just want to try to connect it more tightly to the second part of the talk, which was about the protest movement. So tell me why this is a dumb inference to make. The inference I make from this is, well, Dr. Parreira told me that the municipalities that are controlled by these parties tend to do better on governance indicators than the municipalities that are controlled by independents. She also told me that the poor quality of local governance is a driver of protest. So should I find that there was more protest, not in the places that were controlled by these parties, but in fact in the places that were controlled by the independents because they are worse off than the places controlled by the parties?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's one that I hope with more empirical data on the protests that I can assess. What I would say is that I would say the quality of local governance in places that are really tightly controlled by this cartel of parties versus not is bad in different ways. And I think you kind of see that reflected, not necessarily in the number of people who turn out to protest, but in the types of claims that they're making in different areas. So I would say in a place that's really, really tightly controlled by one of the mainstream political parties like Saida, what I've heard anecdotally is less rhetoric of abandonment and more of coercion. So the notion that people understand the sort of bargain that they've been forced into by these parties. And people understand that the developmental work that has gone on in Saida over the last 5-10 years could have been much, much better if these parties didn't engage in the sort of predatory and corrupt behavior that they do alongside developmental work. Conversely, in places where politics are more chaotic and there's more resistance to the party cartel, like Tripoli, for example, in recent years, you see more of more rhetoric of having been simply abandoned by the state.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, in a way, I mean, you could end up finding something sort of counterintuitive, right? If your dependent variable is how satisfied are you with the local government, as opposed to how well is the local government performing, then you might expect, for example, that if I'm in a place that's controlled by the party cartel, even though I'm doing better than a place that isn't controlled by the party cartel, I know that this is totally corrupt. And in fact, if I had real independents who were able to deliver on their promises, and if resources weren't constrained and held just by these party elites, then in fact, the situation could be much better. And so you might get this situation in which people in municipalities that are doing better are actually less satisfied with the leaders of those municipalities than people in the municipalities that are doing worse. And it's because in the municipalities that are doing better, well, that's all controlled by this party cartel. Whereas in the municipality that's doing worse, it's controlled by, or our local mayor, or whatever the proper title is an independent, and he or she is doing the best that they can despite difficult circumstances. That would be very interesting to tease out. Okay, I have several hands raised, and I'm just going to go in the order in which I see them. So the first person I have is Naima Green Riley.
Christiana, I really enjoyed this talk. I have to run at 1, so I wanted to ask my question up front. I'm curious about, and I know that the point of this talk was specifically to talk about how your research relates to the ongoing protests in Lebanon and to the situation in Lebanon. But now I'm going to do the typical political science thing to do and ask you about looking beyond the specific areas that you're speaking about and look more broadly. So I'm just curious about what you think your preliminary findings say in terms of larger findings about either the effects of protests or central local government relations. So move a little bit towards generalizability here.
Yeah, I would say I try to relate these findings in the dissertation project as well to the mechanisms that are precluding electoral accountability, even in places that look like electoral democracies, and in fact are. There, I mean, Lebanon, by all accounts, in terms of formal measures since 2005, has held free and fair elections. And so why in contexts like this do you still see elites behaving in a way that doesn't serve their constituents in a really flagrant way? And I would say one subgenre of these sort of predatory democracies is party cartel systems. And as Tarek briefly alluded to, there's been work done by Dan Slater and others that talks about how prevalent these sort of party cartel systems are, not only in Lebanon, but also in a variety of other cases. Dan Slater does work on Indonesia. It's also been a facet of politics in Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela, a bunch of other places. That being said, apart from his work and a little bit by others, we really don't understand the conditions under which these types of collusive elite arrangements remain stable and the conditions under which they fall apart. We just know that generally speaking, people don't like them, and oftentimes they engender extra electoral forms of protests. And what I'm hoping is that this research contributes to our understanding of the sort of mechanisms underlying these sorts of scattershot findings that we see across a lot of different places in the world.
The next person I have is Rochelle Mahdi.
Thank you, first of all, for your time today. You didn't speak about this overtly, but I'm wondering if you could draw any conclusions about the shift in sectarian discourse in Lebanon based on your research. I think people who are familiar with Lebanon know that sectarianism is very entrenched across all political spectrums. So if you can speak to that a little bit in any capacity, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, on the one hand, in my research on local governance, I've tried to sort of move away from the ethnic politics framing of Lebanon, not because I think it's bad, but because I think it's been done effectively before. And so I mentioned like sectarianism very little in my research sometimes, and I don't want to underplay that. So I would say on the one hand, I think anybody who's been following the protests in Lebanon understands that this has resulted in like a fundamental change in questioning of sectarian discourse and the way in which political elites in the country leverage sectarianism as a mechanism of fear. And you see people questioning that on an unprecedented level. On the other hand, so I think that's one like very, very obvious component of the protests. And I think, and I don't see that, I see that as a transformation that will remain regardless of the sort of institutional changes that are produced in the coming months or years. But on the other hand, I do think, I did allude to this in the talk, I think there are certain types of incumbent and nascent elites that have been empowered as a result of popular dissatisfaction with the government, who are not necessarily anti-sectarian reformists. You know, I mentioned Ashraf Rifi repeatedly only because he's a paradigmatic example of this. And people like that leverage a really, an even more aggressive form of sectarian discourse as a way of playing upon people's dissatisfaction with the current elites. So you see, I think, these two trends in tandem, and I have no predictions as to, you know, whether one will win out or the other. I suspect that they're both here to stay in terms of what Lebanese politics will look like in the future and the types of elites who are going to get elected in subsequent electoral cycles.
So the next person I have is Professor Bernard Heikel. Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Tarek, and thank you, Christiana, for this talk. I have a question, and they're based on kind of two comments. One is that I saw similar collusion in Yemen between incumbents. And here it was the General People's Congress and the Islah Party. And I wonder if one way to think about this is that these are not groups or parties that are engaged in representation or even in providing services, but rather in selective redistribution of government funds that they control, and that once those funds sort of run out, as they had in Yemen, the collusion and the entire system of managing elections just breaks apart and the country falls apart. And that leads me to then wonder about Lebanon, given the present economic situation, whether the fact that there are no resources left to redistribute, whether we're going to look at a radically different paradigm for politics, where elections, in fact, will become even more meaningless than they have been in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And I'm going to look more into the Yemen case because I'm always looking for other sort of external cases of where elites collude in an analogous way to this. I would completely agree with your framing that these parties are not engaged in holistic representation, but rather in select redistribution to areas of core support in order to sort of maximize their electoral power. In terms of when the money runs out, I think not only I would agree with your general prediction that these trends will be accelerated by increasing economic precarity, but also I think that was a structural factor leading up to these protests as well. So the increased financial burden or the increased financial precarity of major political parties in Lebanon due to lack of foreign funding, you know, due to the bankruptcy of the Future Movement's funding sources in Saudi, and the increased burden put on Iranian sources of funding to Hezbollah by the Syrian civil war. I think of course, these factors also played a role in these parties relying on increasingly coercive strategies and increasingly colluding with one another even more tightly to retain power.
Great. So Banu Aligur is back online, so I'm going to ask her to ask her question.
Thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. I really enjoyed listening to you. My question is about framing efforts on the part of protest organizers. Maybe because of the time limits, you didn't have a chance to talk about this section of your project. I would like to hear your findings regarding the framing efforts of protest organizers, please. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So one reason why I don't talk as much about specific tactics used by protesters is because I think in some respects, I think that's a discussion best left to people who have been really tracking these protests, who have been there every day on the ground. I've made 2 trips, shorter trips to Lebanon since the protests began, but I haven't been, like in the thick of it in the way that a lot of people have. But that being said, I think the one thing that, the things that have struck me have been the things that people have talked about with these protests, the explicit use of nonviolence, and the really persistent framing of the ultimate causes, or the sort of, longer term causes of this governance crisis as lying in the hands not of one particular political party or faction, but in all of them together. And literally, the kilun yani kilun, like all of them means all of them protests. I think that has been a central feature of the protest rhetoric that is basically unprecedented. And it does trace back to a certain extent to the Houston protests in 2015. And I would say locally, to a certain extent, to collusive practice, to satisfaction with collusive practices in municipal elections. But truly, like this, the explicit use of the rhetoric of, it's not just my sectarian leader, and it's not just yours, it's all of them. I think that's really important and completely different, frankly.
Great. Okay, the next question I have is from Lynn Abdouni. So let me unmute her.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much. Christiana, thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it, and I took a lot of notes. I have 2 quick questions. One of them is, in your opinion, what are the markers of change that we need to look for? Is it how people vote? Is it changes in infrastructure? Do we need to see something? And the second very important question that strikes my heart very closely is that the towns that you looked at are particularly concentrated on the coast. You did look at Baalbek, but nothing in the West Bekaa, nothing in Central Bekaa. They have entirely different dynamics. And also, when you talked about Saida, one other thing comes to mind is the large concentration of Palestinian refugees in Saida. How does that factor in your analysis? So maybe that's more than 2, I apologize, but this is very exciting. Thank you.
Thanks, those are all really good points. In terms of, let me go. First, in terms of markers of change, I think that's up for the protest movement to decide. I think this is a movement that has sort of had pretty clear, concise demands in terms of the types of institutional reforms that they want to see. And at least the people that I spoke with when I was there, it was things like the institutions enabling an independent judiciary, the return of funds lost as a result of corruption, and early elections, potentially with new reforms that would enable non-party sponsored opposition groups to perform better, or to have a fighting shot. And so I think those terms that have been defined by the protesters are completely valid, and I think those would be the markers that the movement could use moving forward. In terms of selection of cases, I completely agree. In terms of my main case studies, in my dissertation at least, and in this presentation, I was comparing governance outcomes in Tripoli and Saida, and in part I chose them because they're quite similar on a number of grounds, including, as you mentioned, the presence of Palestinian camps near each city, and to a certain extent that enhances internal validity while taking away from external validity. And so I did look at a number of other municipal case studies, including, as you said, Baalbek, and also I don't include this in the presentation, but I did some fieldwork in Zahle, and looking, I would say, at the behavior of the party cartel and their influence over municipal governance. It's very, very similar in places like Baalbek and Zahle. Of course, I think the Syrian occupation and the direct presence, a more heavy presence of Syrian occupying forces in those parts of the country matters. And I won't go into that at length, but that's something that I think is important in understanding local electoral competition. But again, just choosing a variety of different cases, I think kind of helps paint a picture of what's going on in the country as a whole. And I do completely, agree with the comment that the coast is going to have its own specific dynamics because of historical factors.
Great. Okay. The next question I have here is from Robert Deneen. I'm going to unmute him. Go ahead, sir.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Tarek, and thanks, Christiana. That was a really excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it so much. So I have two questions. I mean, first, you at the very beginning, it seemed that you had a published document. Has this study been published that you've written as such, or is it about to be published as an MEI publication? And substantively, if I could ask, though this goes well beyond the scope of your talk and research, but I can't help but ask, has there been a perception with the resignation of the Hariri government and the appointment of the Diab government, has that been perceived, if I could ask, it goes beyond the scope of the time that it seems that you've been there, but as a victory for the protests in any way, or has it been perceived as such a marginal event, if you will, and just a perpetuation of the status quo and more establishment parties and sort of affirming the source of the protests rather than seen as a victory for them?
Great. So in terms of the first question, I haven't published anything in academic journals yet related to this. I hope to as a result of the dissertation research. I have a piece with Synapse, which is a Beirut-based research consultancy that's available online that kind of summarizes a lot of what I've said today in ordinary people language, not academic language, which might actually be preferable for most people. In terms of the second question, I think it's a really good one. And what I would argue is that the Diab government represents, you know, a portion of, but not all of this party cartel that I described. I do want to de-emphasize the fact that some of the reform initiatives that they've proposed that have subsequently been largely vetoed down by different factions of parliament are an improvement on prior governance. I would say marginally so, but beyond that, the way I see them is because of their composition, because of who they were appointed by, and also because of the constraints that they face from parliament and other party cartel controlled bodies, that they are essentially an extension of the status quo in different form.
Okay, we have 15 minutes left, and I have several people with their hands up. So the next is Dan Azzi. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, how are you, Professor? Good to see you
again. Good to see
you. Christiana, thank you for a very riveting presentation and greetings from Beirut. The question I have for you is slightly similar to Professor Heikel's. I was wondering, bearing in mind the increase in intensity of the economic collapse and the devaluation of the lira since the protests started, is your educated guess that this would strengthen or liven the good types of protests, like the ones that were happening, or will this turn into sectarian, into some sort of sectarian skirmishes to sort of deflect from the real problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question. By the way, I just wanted to say I love your research, and it's nice to e-meet you. But in terms of these I think there's a push and pull dynamic here in terms of increasing economic scarcity. And this is something that I heard activists and people who are really invested in the protest movement speculate about a lot the last time I was in Lebanon earlier this year. On the one hand, you can imagine increasing economic precarity, motivating people to turn out in even larger numbers and motivating them to grow even more dissatisfied with these parties, because these parties are obviously unable to provide the types of resources that they were 5-10 years ago. And that's a trend that's only going to increase. The scarcity is hitting them as well as ordinary people. On the other hand, you might imagine that increased scarcity is going to make people, you know, even more dependent on some of these party networks and the clientelist structures that they've relied on previously. And, you know, that sort of push and pull which direction people are going to be pulled in is probably going to be affected by a lot of other factors as well. And it's probably not going to be a yes or no with regard to everybody across the country. And I don't know, and I don't think anybody really knows what's ultimately going to happen, but this gets to the heart of questions that political scientists haven't yet answered about what clientelism does and does not motivate people to do and under what conditions.
Faris Ghandour.
Hi, thanks, Christiana, for that. I appreciate it. It was very thorough and insightful, and thanks for hosting this, Professor. Quick question around the provision of data and, you know, how institutions function and how various you know, organizations are linked. It seems that there's either no data or, you know, a lack of availability of data to the public around, you know, just the way a lot of things work, from the mundane all the way up to just kind of the stuff that actually maybe matters. It just strikes me as, is that data just non-existent, or does it exist in silos that these people kind of hog and control? And to what extent is that going to make it extremely difficult, or make it just difficult for the opposition, or I guess the protest movement, to emerge from this? You know, it seems like there's nothing to work on today, you know, if you really look at it with regards to availability of data.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think anybody who's listening, who's done particularly quantitative empirical work on Lebanon, is sort of nodding in agreement. Data is very scarce. I think some of that is rooted in the lack of a census, which is obviously a politically driven decision. And a lot of basic baseline data that we would like to have is just not exist. That lack flows from a lack of census. But that being said, irrespective of the census, I would say data on the whole, and this is not particularly unique to Lebanon, this is true of a lot of different Middle Eastern cases that I'm familiar with, data is both scarce and sort of pay to play. So a lot of data housed by government ministries you have to purchase, even things like the confessions of registered voters. And other more detailed aspects of governance, like welfare indicators in particular, are obviously collected by the state, particularly by the Central Administration for Statistics, but only disseminated to the public at the district level at best, or just disseminated, you know, kind of like this is the overall statistic for the country. And so I would agree with your assessment that figuring out local levels disparities in governance, particularly when you get down to municipalities where there's over 1,000 of them, is really difficult. And that's why, as you can see from the presentation, I rely almost exclusively on original data that I collected, or that, you know, research organizations that I partner with collected. And this is expensive and time consuming. And so obviously this is dissuading people from, this is precluding people from having like a richer understanding of what governance looks like, including Lebanese who want to have that sense in their own country. But that being said, I think there are some innovative data collection efforts out there. Collection of data on protest activity, for example, is ongoing and open source. And I think that there's like a new generation of people in Lebanon who understand data availability to be linked to power, and who want to create data and make it more openly available for the reasons that you described.
The last person I have on the list is Sadir from Impact Lebanon. Unmute.
Correct, it's Sadir. So thank you, Christiana and Professor. My question is about the diaspora in the world. So where, you know, many Lebanese people live, and the situation is quite different there because we don't have local government. The protests are not localized. Instead, people from all around the country protested in, you know, in all around the world. So my question is, if you were to study these protests, what empirical data would you look at, and what questions would you ask?
Yeah, and I think the interesting component of the protest specifically, and obviously play more generally, and particularly the influence of like remittances as a mechanism for sort of keeping the economy afloat, I think has been well documented. In terms of where protests should be more likely to occur, I have no priors, because I have no priors on the specific sort of distribution of Lebanese in the diaspora community. But I certainly think Lebanese protesting abroad is something, I mean, something that I hadn't really, maybe just because I hadn't observed like a protest every day in the way that I have with Lebanon, but I certainly hadn't seen previously. And also Lebanese returning and protesting in their respective hometowns. I think that's something that's extraordinary, and I hope is sustained.
Okay, the quality of Dr. Parreira's internet connection seems to be dropping out, and so I think you know, the gods are telling us that this intellectual feast that we've been enjoying for the last 80 or so minutes should now be concluded. So, Christiana, I think if we're all in the same room, you would be deafened now by thunderous applause and thanks from all of the people here for a really fantastic talk. And in answer to Bob Deneen's question, one thing that we will be doing is over the next few months putting working papers by various MEI fellows this year online, and Dr. Parreira's will be among those. And so there will be an opportunity hopefully to engage with that work before it becomes an award-winning work in the field of comparative politics. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Parreira. This is our last event of the semester, but we will try to do some things over the course of the summer, and we'll look forward to meeting some of you again then. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, Tarek.